Welcome to History Sleep. Tonight we're going to talk about the history of Cowboy, their daily life, prominent figures, their rise and their downfall. The first cowboys' vaquero origins on the frontier. Long before the cowboy became an American icon, mounted cattle herders roamed the plains under a different name, vaqueros. The word vaquero, from the Spanish vaca cow, described the skilled horsemen of colonial Mexico who tended sprawling herds of cattle. In the 1500s, Spanish conquistadors introduced horses and cattle to the New World, and native peoples of Mexico learned to ride and ranch from these Europeans. Thus were born the vaqueros, indigenous and mestizo riders trained by missionaries. And ranchers in New Spain, with braided rawhide lassos coiled at their sides and custom saddles beneath them, these expert riders became indispensable on the vast open ranges of the Southwest. Hundreds of years before Texas cowboys drove longhorns north, vaqueros had already perfected the art of herding cattle across rugged country. In Spanish colonial days, large haciendas and mission ranches in what is now Mexico and the American Southwest relied on vaqueros to manage livestock. Cattle imported from Spain often ran wild on the unfenced ranges. Mounted vaqueros galloped over deserts and chaparral, looping their riatas lassos around stray steers to bring them back. Their equipment reflected both Iberian heritage and New World innovation. They introduced the lariat, a strong braided rope essential for roping cattle, and wore sturdy leather leggings called chaparreras, or chaps, to guard against thorny brush. A traveler in those early days might have witnessed a vaquero astride a muscular mustang, broad sombrero casting shade from the desert sun, swinging a lasso in a wide loop, a timeless scene that would later be romanticized in countless cowboy tales. Yet the daily work of these early cowboys was born of necessity, not romance. By the late 1700s, Spanish missions in California and elsewhere depended on vaquero herdsmen to supply meat and hides in a frontier where food was often scarce. Before barbed wire and modern corrals, it took expert ropers to catch free-ranging cattle. It's a forgotten history of centuries of horsemanship in the Americas, notes historian Pablo Rangel, emphasizing how vaqueros were rooted in the colonial past. They tamed wild horses and threw the lariat with uncanny skill, feats that set them apart from ordinary riders. Many vaqueros were rough-hewn young men, adept with horse and rope, who spent long stretches far from home trailing herds wherever pasture could be found. Their culture gave rise to enduring trademarks of the cowboy trade: the wide-brimmed hat, high-heeled boots, jingling spurs, and bandanas to guard against dust, all variations on the style these Mexican cowboys developed on the range. As Spanish rule gave way to Mexican independence and eventually U.S. expansion, the vaquero tradition spread north. Nowhere did it take firmer root than in Texas. By the early 19th century, Texas was still a sparsely settled region of northern Mexico, dotted with cattle ranches inherited from the Spanish era. Mexican ranch owners relied on vaqueros to round up the semi-wild longhorn cattle that multiplied on the open prairies. When Texas became an independent republic in 1836 and then joined the United States in 1845, Anglo-American settlers flooded in, eager to raise cattle on the rich grasslands. These newcomers found a ready model in the vaquero system. They adopted the practice of open-range ranching, letting cattle roam freely over unfenced land, then periodically gathering them in great roundups for sorting and branding. The skills and terminology of the vaquero were absorbed into Texas ranch life. Terms like lasso, rodeo, bronco, and cinch came straight from Spanish usage, as did the techniques of handling cattle from horseback. One observer would later note that the American cowboy's genealogy owed far more to Spanish vaqueros than to any European knight or rider of lore. The Texas Longhorn itself, the quintessential cowboy cow, was a product of this fusion. These rangy, hardy cattle descended from Spanish stock and thrived in the wild, arid terrain without much human coddling. Lean and athletic, with horns spanning 6 feet, Longhorns could survive on sparse grasses and endure long drives, though their meat was tougher than that of fattened eastern cattle. By the mid-1800s, millions of Longhorns wandered across Texas. An astonished writer noted that by 1860, wild cattle were so numerous that a man could ride for days in Texas and always be in sight of a bovine, as later paraphrased, truly. Texas was a cattleman's paradise in the making, and it was the vaquero tradition that provided the blueprint for taming it. The vaqueros did not disappear with the U.S. takeover of the Southwest. They became teachers and co-workers to the next generation of cowboys. In the 1840s and 50s, Texas ranchers like Captain Richard King founder of the legendary King Ranch, actually recruited vaqueros from Mexico, entire families, known as Los Guineos King's people, to live and work on their ranches. These Mexican cowboys brought invaluable expertise in horse breaking, roping, and cattle driving. Through long years of service, they helped transform Texan ranching into a thriving industry, even introducing improved breeding practices that produced hardier stock. The American cowboy's saddle, spurs, and lariat were direct inheritors of vaquero design, and even his flamboyant riding style, riding tall yet loose in the saddle, ready for sudden moves, echoed the Lagunita style developed in Spain and passed through Mexico. Whenever a modern ranch hand ropes a stray or a rodeo performer twirls a dazzling lasso trick, they are paying silent homage to those first vaqueros of the frontier. By the eve of the Civil War, a unique cowboy culture was firmly rooted in Texas and the Southwest, a blend of Spanish vaquero, indigenous, black, and Anglo traditions. This young breed of American cowboy had learned from his vaquero forebears how to survive in the saddle and live by his wits under an unforgiving sun. He was about to be tested as never before, for on the horizon, great events loomed that would transform the cattle trade and elevate the cowboy from hired drover to folk hero. The trails north beckoned, and with them, the golden age of the cowboy was set to unfold, forged by hard riding and rawhide, tragedy and triumph, reality and myth. Trail drives and daily life on the open range. 18 at first light. A cowboy stirred from his bedroll on the ground, the prairie sky just turning pink. He kicked the ashes of last night's campfire back to life and held a tin cup of coffee close. For warmth, all around, scattered on the dew-laced grass, other cowhens were rising in the dim dawn to start another long day pushing cattle up the trail. Life on a cattle drive was a mix of monotony and sudden peril, of routine chores and wild, unpredictable turns. The romantic image of the cowboy riding free beneath endless skies only tells part of the story. In truth, theirs was a life of grinding work and constant vigilance. As one historian put it, real cowboys on the great trail drives mostly led lives of numbing tedium, usually on the fringes of society, even as they became symbols of adventure. Day in and day out, these men and a few women toiled from before sunup to after sundown, with little more than their horse, their herd, and their fellow riders for company. A typical day on the Chisholm Trail or Goodnight Loving Trail began well before sunrise. The cook's wake-up call, a few loud clangs on the iron skillet, or the echo of a dinner bell signaled the drovers to roll up their blankets and gather at the chuck wagon for a quick breakfast. In the pre-dawn chill, they squatted by the wagon, wolfing down black coffee, beans, biscuits, and maybe bacon if rations allowed. An early start was crucial. With hundreds, sometimes thousands of cattle to move, the crew needed to be driving the herd as soon as it was light enough to see. As one trail driver later recalled, "We were up every morning at 4, in the saddle and circling the herd by daylight." The chuck wagon, invented in 1866 by Charles Goodnight to support long trail drives, was the cowboy's lifeline on wheels. Stocked with sacks of flour, dried salt pork, coffee, and cast iron pots, its wooden chuck box folded out into a cooking station each morning and evening. The cook, often a grizzled old cowboy past riding age, was equal parts chef, doctor, and referee, serving up meals and patching up minor injuries, all while enduring the complaints of hungry cowboys. Despite the humble fare, the men eagerly gathered around the wagon for hot grub whenever the schedule allowed. 23 cowboys on the Zit Ranch gather at a chuck wagon for a meal on the open range. C1902. The chuck wagon, first devised by cattleman Charles Goodnight in 1866, carried food, coffee, and supplies for long trail drives. Once fed and mounted on fresh horses, the cowboys spread out to perform the morning roundup. The herd, which had been left loosely grazing overnight under the watch of night guards, had to be gathered and urged back onto the trail. Cowboys rode out in pairs, shouting and whistling at stragglers hidden in gulches or behind clumps of mesquite. Soon the longhorns were trooping along in a dusty column, bawling in protest as they were prodded forward. Two experienced men rode at the front as point riders, guiding the leaders of the herd. Others flanked the sides as swing and flank riders, keeping the bulk of the cattle bunched and moving. A couple of hands trailed in the rear as drag riders, a miserable post where one ate the heaviest dust kicked up by hundreds of hooves. The trail boss, often astride the best horse, roamed wherever he was needed, scouting the path ahead, checking the condition of the stragglers, or riding back to the chuck wagon to confer with the cook about the next water hole. Mile by mile, hour after hour, The outfit pushed north at a slow walk. On a good day, they might cover 10 to 15 miles of prairie. For the cowboys, boredom was a constant companion. We'd sing to keep from going loco out there, one old trail hand remembered. Many cowboys hummed or sang cowboy songs, lonesome ballads, and comic ditties to calm the cattle and themselves. The vastness of the plains and the sameness of the days could wear down even hardened men, but any moment of complacency could turn to chaos without warning. A rabbit darting from the brush, a distant clap of thunder, even a cowboy's sneeze might spook a few cattle, whose panic could ripple into a thundering stampede in seconds. When thousands of pounds of beef suddenly bolted in a blind run, the ground trembled and a low thunder grew into a terrifying roar. There is cattle running. Coming like hail, wrote Cowboy Nate Champion in his diary during a fight, but he could as well have been describing a midnight stampede. Cowboys sprang to action, riding hard alongside the stampeding beasts, shouting and firing six-shooters in the air to turn the leaders and gradually mill the herd into a circle. Stopping a stampede was among the most dangerous duties. Horses could stumble in prairie dog holes, or a rider could be unseated and trampled in the dark. Yet it had to be done, or the herd and fortunes would scatter for miles. Through experience, cowboys learned tricks like running the lead cattle in a wide loop, gradually slowing them until the herd became one giant wagon wheel of circling animals that could then be halted and reorganized. More than a few men lost their lives in stampedes. For the rest, the memory of pounding hooves and flying horns was an enduring nightmare of trail life. 25 most days were thankfully less dramatic. By noon, the trail boss would signal a halt near water if possible, and the herd would be allowed to rest and graze for an hour. The chuck wagon trundled up for dinner lunch, often no more than hardtack biscuits and maybe stew. A cowboy might refill his canteen, check his horse's hooves for stones, or steal a quick nap in the shade of the wagon. Then it was back to work, urging the reluctant cattle onward. Weather was a fickle master. A blazing sun could parch men and animals alike, while sudden thunderstorms turned trails into quagmires. Lightning terrified the herd. During storms, cowboys spread out to keep the cattle calm, singing or talking. To them, we often rode all night in the rain, just to hold the herd together, one veteran recalled. If a river crossed the trail, it posed another trial. Crossing cattle over water. At a major river like the Red or the Arkansas, the cowboys would scout for a shallow ford, then drive the lead steers in. Cattle would swim if needed, but they balked at strong currents or slippery banks. Seasoned trail bosses knew to let the herd drink, then push the boldest steers across and the rest would follow. Even so, there were wrecks. Cattle swept downstream. Wagons overturned, a poor beeve or horse sucked under by quicksand. The cowboys themselves sometimes stripped and swam their mounts to guide scared cattle across. It was all in a day's work. By evening, after perhaps 10 or 12 hours in the saddle, the crew made camp. They let the cattle spread out to graze on fresh grass, but assigned 2 men at a time to ride night herd. These night guards took shifts circling the resting cattle till dawn, softly singing cowboy lullabies or just murmuring woo-haw to reassure the animals. They knew that a sudden disturbance could still send the herd careening off in a midnight stampede, so the night riders remained alert under the blanket of stars. Meanwhile, the others gathered around the chuck wagon for a hot supper by the campfire. Beans, salt pork or beef, black coffee, maybe dried apples. For dessert, the fare was simple but filling. The cook, sometimes called Cusspot for his colorful language, was simultaneously the most respected and feared man in camp. Woe to the cowhand who complained about the food within earshot of the cook's big stirring spoon. Yet the men depended on him utterly for their sustenance. After supper, they might indulge in a smoke or swap tall tales by the fire. In those moments, bonds of camaraderie formed that many recalled years later with fondness. A truer set of men never lived than these wild sons of the plains, always ready to share their blanket and last ration, wrote famed black cowboy Nat Love of his frontier companions. Indeed, out on the range, far from civilization, cowboys developed their own rough code of hospitality and loyalty. Each depended on the other in countless ways. A simple error or act of cowardice by one man could endanger the entire outfit. 26 come nightfall, most cowboys rolled themselves into their blankets or sugans on the ground. The lucky or fastidious might have a canvas tarpaulin to keep off dew, with the sky as their ceiling and often using their saddle as a pillow. They snatched a few hours of sleep before the routine began anew. It was a Spartan life. One cowboy dryly summarized the trail life as 8 months of work for 2 months' pay, noting that at trail's end a typical hand might earn $30 or $40, much of which would then vanish during a brief raucous spree in the saloons of a Kansas cowtown. The work was dirty, no baths for weeks, lonely and sometimes deadly. Yet, for all that, many looked back on those years as the most free and adventurous time of their lives. Around the campfire, the cowboys created a folklore of their own, embellishing true events and swapping yarns about outlaw encounters, loyal horses, or spectral lights on the plains. By the time those stories filtered eastward, they would feed the growing legend of the cowboy as a near mythic figure. But on the trail itself, underneath the stars and with the smell of wood smoke in the air, the men likely felt simply tired, hungry, and content in the knowledge of a hard job well done. Tools of the trade: horses, gear, and guns. No figure in the American West is more defined by his accoutrements than the cowboy. From the tip of his wide-brimmed hat to the spurs on his boot heels, every piece of a cowboy's gear was adapted to a specific purpose on the range or trail. Over years of trial and error, borrowing heavily from vaquero tradition, cowboys developed a distinctive outfit that was both practical and often flamboyant. An old-timer once observed that although most cowboy clothing was functional, even functional dress had some cowboy flair. Indeed, these trappings of the West have become iconic in American culture, symbolizing rugged independence and frontier spirit. Consider the cowboy hat, perhaps the most recognizable piece of Western wear. Early cowboys wore all kinds of headgear: derby bowlers, Civil War caps, even old top hats, but by the 1870s the Stetson felt hat reigned supreme. John B. Stetson introduced his Boss of the Plains hat in 1865, and its high crown and broad brim quickly proved ideal for Western conditions. Cowboys shaped their Stetsons to personal taste. Some creased the crown or rolled the brim, creating a sort of signature look. A good fur felt hat was expensive. Texas cowboy Teddy Blue Abbott paid $10 for a Stetson, a third of a month's wages in 1878. But it was worth every penny. As one range rider noted, that hat was a multi-purpose tool. It had fanned many an ember into flame for a fire, had served to dip into a creek or water hole to drink from, had been used to spook a horse or slap him on the rump. Worn and weather-beaten though it became, a cowboy's hat was as trusty as an old friend. Around his neck, almost every cowhand knotted a bandana or wild rag, typically a large cotton or silk kerchief. This versatile cloth protected against the omnipresent dust on a long drive. A bandana pulled over the nose was a literal lifesaver in choking trail dust behind the herd. It also provided warmth on a cold morning, could be dunked in water and worn wet around the neck to cool off, or used as an emergency bandage or sling. Interestingly, the word bandana itself comes from an Indian term meaning tie-dye. Reflecting the global tapestry of cowboy gear, silk bandanas were imported early on, later replaced by cheaper cotton prints. Clothing had to withstand hard use. Cowboys typically wore long-sleeved cotton or wool shirts, often pullovers without buttons that could catch on brush. These could be brightly colored or simple, but durability was key. One popular fabric was hickory stripe, a tough cotton noted for its hickory-like toughness. Over the shirt might go a vest, full of pockets for matches, tobacco, or a watch, things one wanted handy on the trail. Trousers were originally wool or canvas. In the later years of the 19th century, denim jeans, then called overalls, made by companies like Levi Strauss, became common for their sturdiness. However, on the northern ranges, many still preferred wool trousers, which were warmer and more comfortable in the saddle. One English visitor in 1884 noted with surprise that many cowboys wore fancy wool pants with a trademark patch on the back, a far cry from the rough homespun he expected. Regardless of material, trousers were often secured with suspenders belts. Came into wider use later, and they inevitably got torn by brush or worn thin by saddle friction. To protect those legs and pants, cowboys relied on chaps leather leggings buckled over the trousers. The earliest design, borrowed from Mexican vaqueros, was the chaparreras from chaparral, dense thorn scrub. These were essentially two pieces of thick leather that covered the front of the legs, joined by a belt. They served as armor against mesquite thorns, cactus spines, and the horns of ornery cattle during close encounters. By the Great Trail Drive era, Texas cowboys wore batwing chaps with efflard bottoms or shotgun chaps, straight, narrow legs depending on regional style. In the northern plains, where winters were bitter, many adopted Wooley's shaggy sheepskin chaps to add warmth against blizzards. Chaps not only saved a man's hide from injury but also became a canvas for personal style. Some were plain and works-carved. Others were decorated with elaborate tooling, fringe or silver concos round ornaments along the belt. A good pair of chaps might last many years of riding and were often worn with pride, bearing the marks of countless adventures. No discussion of cowboy gear is complete without the boots. A true cowboy boot was a marvel of functional design. By most accounts, the classic high-heeled cowboy boot was developed around the time of the Civil War and refined in Kansas or Texas boot shops by the 1870s. Unlike flat-heeled work boots, these had a tall heel underslung to keep the rider's foot from slipping through the stirrup, a pointed toe to guide the foot in quickly, and a high top often reaching nearly to the knee to protect the lower legs. Pull straps helped tug the boots on, since they fit snugly. A cowboy often had to break in new boots painfully. An early rider recounted his feet burned and ached and blistered in his first pair, until a seasoned trail boss showed him a trick of soaking oats in water inside the boots to stretch them overnight. Once broken in, the boots were like a second skin. Cowboys walked a bit bow-legged partly due to the high heels, and the boots' distinctive click and posture became part of the cowboy swagger. Many boots were decorated with stitching or even star designs on the poles or tops. One cowboy's boots had a big red and white star sewn on each, but the fancy stitching wasn't just for show, it also stiffened the leather around the ankle for support. A good pair of boots was prized. They might cost 10-20, a small fortune then. They were so important that a common bequest in a cowboy's will was his boots and saddle to a friend. Strapped to those boots, or sometimes to the heel itself, were the spurs. Spurs allowed a rider to cue his horse with a touch of the heel. Western spurs typically had a small wheel rowel with dulled points enough to urge a horse without injuring it. Spurs ranged from plain iron to ornate silver inlaid works of art. Some vaquero-style spurs had large rowels that jingled, giving the rider a musical swagger with each step, while spurs could symbolize authority over the horse. A good cowboy prided himself on a gentle touch. The best cowponies responded to knee pressure and voice, needing only light spur guidance. Still, the sight and sound of a pair of big spurs on a cowboy's heels, jingle bobs rattling, became one more element of his mystique. Of course, the horse itself was the cowboy's most crucial tool. A good cowpony was worth more than any coat or gun. Often small, quick, and hardy mustangs or crossbreeds, these horses could work cattle intuitively, seeming to know when to stop or turn on a dime to head off a wayward steer. Cowboys usually kept a string of several horses, known as a remuda. On a drive each day, a fresh mount would be used while the others rested, typically rotating through a half-dozen mounts over a journey. Horses, like their riders, developed personalities. Some were steady old reliables, others were fiery and required an experienced hand. A well-trained cutting horse could enter a herd and, with minimal guidance, isolate a single cow, mirroring its every dodge and dash. Many cowboys forged bonds of trust with their mounts that ran deep. In songs and stories they praised faithful horses that saved their lives in floods or stampedes. The saddle that connected man and horse was another inheritance from Mexico. The Western stock saddle featured a high fork and a horn on the pommel, that horn being vital for dallying a lasso wrapping the rope after catching livestock. When a cowboy threw his loop around a running steer, he would take a couple of turns of the rope around the saddle horn. The horse, digging in its hooves, acted as a living anchor to stop the animal. The strain on saddle and horn was enormous. So saddles were built on sturdy wooden trees wrapped in rawhide. They were heavy, often 30-40 pounds, but almost indestructible. Many had tapaderos leather covers on the stirrups to prevent brush from snagging the rider's feet. Saddles were often the most expensive item a cowboy owned, some handed down from mentor to apprentice. They could also be decorated, hand-tooled leather patterns, silver concos, or an embossed ranch brand on the fenders. But whether fancy or plain, a proper saddle was essential for spending 15 hours a day on horseback without being rubbed raw. For tucked into that saddle or worn on the belt was yet another iconic set of tools. The firearms. Popular imagination pictures every cowboy forever armed with a Colt 6-shooter on the hip and a Winchester rifle in hand. In reality, not all working. Cowboys carried guns at all times. It could be cumbersome on long rides, and dangerous to be dragged by a snagged revolver if thrown from a horse. But on the lawless frontier and during open-range days, a firearm was certainly common. The Colt single-action army revolver, the famed Peacemaker, introduced in 1873, became a favorite for its reliability and quick draw in emergencies like warding off rustlers or putting down an injured animal. Many cowboys also had a lever-action rifle, like the Winchester Model 1873, which could reach farther and hit harder than a revolver useful for predators animal or human. These weapons, however, were considered tools more than weapons of machismo. A frontier saying went, "Wear a gun in town and you're looking for trouble. Wear one on the trail and you're prepared for it." The sidearm was often used to signal or scare, such as firing in the air to halt a stampede. Still, range violence was a reality, and a good 6-shot could save a man's life. Interestingly, some ranch outfits discouraged carrying sidearms on drives to reduce drunken gunplay when cowboys hit town. But overall, as one museum curator notes, no cowboy would have considered his outfit complete without one firearm. The gun, whether a battered Cole Taurus Leek Remington, was as much a part of the cowboy silhouette as the hat. The Cowboy 1888, a photograph of a Dakota Territory cowboy by John C. H. Grabill. In this iconic image, the cowboy's gear is on full display: wide-brimmed hat, bandana, revolver on his hip, and the indispensable horse and saddle. Even beyond clothing and weapons, cowboys had myriad other tools: ropes usually braided rawhide or later manila hemp lariats around 30-60 feet long, branding irons for marking cattle at roundups, bullwhips or quirts, short horsewhips occasionally, used to drive stubborn animals, knives for everything from eating to cutting leather, and canteens for precious water in dry country. On the trail, the chuck wagon carried spare horseshoes and farrier tools, because a lame horse could spell disaster if not quickly reshod. There were also personal effects like a deck of cards, perhaps a harmonica or a fiddle for music around. The fire and precious letters or a Bible tucked away in a saddlebag. Many cowboys were young late teens or early 20s and carried little beyond the essentials. But one thing almost every cowboy had was a coiled lasso on his saddle, and a keen knife on his belt, symbols of his trade. Out of these practical necessities emerged a kind of rough fashion. Cowboys took pride in their outfit, not out of vanity but identity. When a young Teddy Blue Abbott got paid off in 1878, he immediately bought a new white Stetson, new pants, and a good shirt, proudly dressing just right for the first time as a top hand. The trail could be brutal on gear clothes tore, hats blew away, boots wore out, yet cowboys improvised repairs on the fly with rawhide thongs or prickly pear needle and thread. Each scar on a hat brim or notch in a spur carried a story. The gear was an extension of the cowboy's very being. In fact, many cowboys even slept with their guns and kept their horses hobbled nearby, a testament to the close relationship between man, beast, and equipment on the frontier. Over time, as stories of the Wild West spread, these items, the Stetson hat, bandana, 6-shooter, saddle, and spurs, took on a life of their own in popular culture, becoming shorthand for the Western hero, but on the late 19th century range. They were simply what a person needed to survive a rough, demanding job in a rough, demanding land. Boom times on the range: longhorns, trails, and cowtowns. In the decades after the Civil War, the American West experienced a cattle boom that was unprecedented, a time when millions of longhorn cattle roamed free on the plains, and cowboys drove vast herds across hundreds of miles to feed a nation hungry for beef. It was during this period, roughly the late 1860s through mid-1880s, that the classic image of the trail-driving cowboy was truly born. Everything seemed to converge to make the cattle frontier flourish. Texas had the cattle, the North had the appetite, and between them lay a sea of grass awaiting enterprising herdsmen. One historian aptly dubbed it a beef bonanza. Fortunes were made and lost on the hoof of a cow, and the cowboy was the linchpin laborer of this booming industry. During the Civil War 1861-65, Texas ranches were largely cut off from markets. Cattle multiplied until, by war's end, the state was bursting with beef. An estimated 5 million head of cattle wandered Texas, far exceeding local demand. Meanwhile, in the war-torn South and industrial North, beef was scarce and pricey. A $4 longhorn in Texas might fetch $40 back east. The potential profit was irresistible. The challenge, however, was getting the cattle to the railroads that could carry them to distant slaughterhouses and cities. Texas itself had few rail lines right after the war, but railroads were expanding westward, and enterprising men realized that if cowboys could trail herds to the railheads in Kansas or other states, immense profits could be reaped. Thus began the great cattle drives. The first step was to find a route. In 1867, a young livestock dealer named Joseph G. McCoy struck a deal to create a shipping point in Abilene, Kansas, just west of a quarantine line that Kansas had established. To prevent the spread of Texas cattle fever, a tick-borne disease, McCoy built cattle pens and advertised that Texas drovers would find a safe, well-paying market there. Coincidentally, a trading trail long used by a half-Cherokee rancher, Jesse Chisholm, led to that vicinity from Indian Territory. In 1867, the first drives along this route arrived, and McCoy's stockyards in Abilene saw over 35,000 head shipped that year. The trail, soon called the Chisholm Trail, quickly became a highway of hoofbeats by 1870. As many as 300,000 cattle a year were being driven up the Chisholm to Kansas railheads. Other trails followed, the Great Western Trail also called the Western Trail or Dodge City Trail further west through Texas to Dodge City, Kansas. The Goodnight Loving Trail leading from West Texas into New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. And numerous lesser-known routes branching off to Missouri, Nebraska, and even Montana. For roughly 2 decades, these trails were the arteries of the cattle kingdom. 52 driving cattle was both big business and epic adventure. A typical herd might number 2,000,30,000 head, tended by 10-15 cowboys, a trail boss, a cook, and a wrangler to manage the horse herd. Starting often in spring, April, or May in South Texas, they aimed to reach Kansas by late summer or early fall when the grass was good and buyers were plentiful. They crossed wide rivers like the Brazos and Red, trudged over the Indian Territory plains, and finally funneled into the infamous cow towns of Kansas. Places like Dodge City, Abilene, Ellsworth, and Wichita blossomed from tiny hamlets to boisterous boomtowns almost overnight. Dodge City, on the rail line's end, earned nicknames like Queen of the Cowtowns and Bibulous Babylon of the frontier for its reputation of liquor and lawlessness, an observer in Dodge at the height of the trade described it as full of saloons, gambling halls, dance halls, and very little of anything else. After months of discipline on the trail, cowboys often let off steam in these towns, leading to legendary chaos that brought sheriffs and marshals like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok to fame as tamers of the wild street scenes. For the cattle barons and investors, the profits were astounding. In an era when a laborer might make $1 a day, a single drive could gross tens of thousands of dollars. Open-range ranching spread rapidly. Rich Eastern and British financiers invested in giant ranches in Texas, Wyoming, Montana. By the early 1880s, many thought the bonanza would last forever. One promotional book in 1881 was even titled The Beef Bonanza, or How to Get Rich on the Plains. It enticed speculators with promises that the West's free grass was a path to easy wealth, and indeed, for a time, fortunes were made. Cities like Cheyenne, Wyoming became wealthy cattle capitals. Cheyenne boasted some of the nation's first electric streetlights and a lavish club where millionaire ranchers dined on oysters shipped from the coasts. In Texas, ranch dynasties like the King Ranch expanded to control hundreds of thousands of acres. Yet all this expansion carried the seeds of its end. The very abundance of cattle led to overstocking and overgrazing. The free grass that seemed endless began to dwindle under the hooves of too many herds. Meanwhile, small farmers' homesteaders were moving into the plains, and they did not mix well with free-roaming cattle. Armed with the Homestead Act of 1862, settlers claimed 1/6-acre parcels of prairie, often right in the middle of prime grazing land. These sodbusters began to string barbed wire around their claims after Joseph Glidden's invention of barbed wire in 1874 made fencing cheap and effective. To the big ranchers and trail drivers, barbed wire was a dire threat. They called it the devil's rope because it blocked traditional trails and waterholes. Range conflict lard as cowboys, often at their boss's behest, cut fences to open up routes, many a midnight fence cutting raid led to shooting confrontations between cowboys and farmers. By the early 1880s, the once open range was increasingly a patchwork of fenced ranches and farms, presaging an end to the old way of drifting cattle freely across state lines. Before that end arrived, however, the cattleman's biggest enemy turned out to be nature itself. After several drought-scorched summers, the winter of 1886 to 1887 hit the northern plains with brutal fury. Blizzards piled snow 4 feet deep. Temperatures plummeted far below zero. Cattle, already weakened from overgrazing and lack of forage, died by the hundreds of thousands in what came to be known as the Big Die-Up in Texas and across the plains up to Montana. Ranchers lost 50 to 80% of their stock. Carcasses littered the range when the snow finally melted. The open-range cattle boom had met its cataclysm. It was a terrible sight, dead cattle everywhere, like driftwood, wrote one cowboy. Rich outfits went bankrupt. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association saw its membership plummet 80% in a few years. The bubble had burst, financially and literally, on the plains. Still, while the Great Trail Drive era was waning by the late 1880s, its impact was enormous. It had firmly planted the cowboy in the national imagination. Those long, dusty drives up the Chisholm and Western trails became the stuff of legend, celebrated in song and story even as they were happening, and they had tangible outcomes. Cowtowns like Abilene and Dodge City flourished and then faded once the railroads extended closer to Texas. By the 1880s, the rails reached places like Fort Worth, obviating the need for such long drives. Massive ranches sprang up in territories like Wyoming, for example, the 3 million acres at ranch in the Texas Panhandle, financed by British investors and then were subdivided or closed when economics turned sour as it sold off its last cattle. By 1912, these boom and bust cycles were common in the West, but none left such a romantic aura as the cattle boom. For those 2 golden decades, the cowboy was truly king of the plains, guiding the wealth on for hooves that powered an era. Amid the boom, certain historic events and personalities stood out. In 1866, Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving blazed the Goodnight-Loving Trail westward, at one point fighting off Comanche attacks. The story of Loving's death after a skirmish and Goodnight's honoring of his wish to be carried back to Texas for burial became a frontier epic inspiring novels like Lonesome Dove. In 1871, the drive to Abilene peaked with over 600,000 cattle arriving that season, a chaotic flood that nearly overwhelmed the town. Sheriffs like Wild Bill Hickok in Abilene and later Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp in Dodge City gained fame and sometimes exaggerated credit for standing down rowdy trail hands and keeping a semblance of order when the Texans rode in. In Dodge, the slogan "Get out of Dodge" was quite literal. Lawmen would sometimes run troublemakers out of town at gunpoint. These anecdotes, spread via newspapers and word of mouth, painted a picture of the Wild West that Americans in the East found thrilling and alarming in equal measure. Through it all, the cowboys themselves remained the essential cogs in the machine. During the boom, they were plentiful. One estimate claims that at the peak of the cattle drives, some 40,000 cowboys were at work on the Great Plains. They came from all backgrounds: ex-Confederate soldiers, young drifters from eastern farms, Mexican vaqueros, freed slaves from the South, and Native Americans looking for work after the buffalo were gone. On the trail, these diverse riders forged a brotherhood, as we will explore in the next chapter, and a professional ethos. They took pride in doing a tough job well, and in their unique position at the center of a national enterprise. As one Kansas newspaper observed in 1878, when a trail herd arrived in town, the bronzed, sunny-faced cowboys have an air of adventure about them, knights of the saddle, princes of the prairies. Such florid descriptions hinted that, even then, people understood the cowboy was more than just hired muscle. He was becoming an American legend in the making. Little did they know that the heyday would be brief. But while it lasted, the range was wide open, the beef trade boomed, and the cowboy reign over the plains was unquestioned. It was an era of big skies, big herds, and big dreams, a time when a fellow with a fast horse and a steady nerve could carve his name in cattle country and perhaps, just perhaps, get rich on the open range. Blood on the plains, range wars, and conflict beneath the vast skies of the West. Conflicts simmered and sometimes exploded in violent struggles for land, water, and cattle that came to be known as the Range Wars. These clashes pitted rancher against homesteader, big cattle baron against small rancher, and sometimes cattlemen against sheepherders or rustlers. The cowboy found himself embroiled in these disputes, either as a hired gun for powerful interests or as a settler defending a hard-won stake. The image of the lone cowboy riding fence lines could turn into scenes of smoke, gunfire, and revenge when range wars erupted. And among these, none became more infamous than the Wyoming conflict called the Johnson County War of 1892, a deadly showdown that epitomized the vicious extremes of the cattle boom's final years. As we saw, after the big die-up of 1886–87, decimated herds, many large outfits were hurting. They laid off cowboys to cut costs, but those unemployed cowboys did not all leave. Some stayed and started small ranches of their own, eking out a living by gathering unbranded strays, mavericks, to build herds. Under the Homestead Act, a savvy cowboy could claim 160 acres along a creek, gaining a slice of water and grass. to the big established ranchers often organized in powerful stock growers associations. These upstart ranchers and settlers were seen as interlopers and rustlers, cattle thieves, even if many were simply picking up unclaimed cattle or legitimately buying stock. Tensions escalated as more farmers fenced land, sometimes cutting off access to streams the large outfits had used for years. The free range was closing, and the old kings of the range were not happy. In Wyoming, the most dramatic conflict unfolded. Wealthy cattle barons, many from out east or Europe, controlled huge leases of public land and dominated local politics through the Wyoming Stock Growers Association USGA. They began to perceive that in Johnson County, a relatively remote northern county, small ranchers, many of them former cowboys, were branding and selling calves that the big outfits claimed as theirs. The USGA labeled these locals cattle thieves and decided to take matters into their own hands. What followed reads like a chapter from a wild dime novel, yet it was brutal reality. The cattlemen hired an army of hitmen in April 1892, a posse of 50-odd armed men, including hired Texas gunfighters, USGA insiders, and even a few East Coast marksmen, rode into Johnson County with a list of 70 names marked for death. They carried dynamite, Winchester rifles, and plenty of rope for lynching. Backing them, shockingly, was the tacit support of Wyoming's acting governor and some U.S. senators. This was vigilantism on a paramilitary scale. The invaders' first target was a small ranch at Crazy Woman Creek, where they expected to find supposed rustlers. Instead, they encountered two innocent trappers, whom they nonetheless shot. Moving on, they surrounded the KC Ranch cabin where 4 men, including a well-known local cowboy named Nate Champion, were staying at dawn. On April 9, 1892, gunfire erupted. Champion's friend Nick Ray fell mortally wounded in the doorway. Champion himself fought like a hero out of legend. He held off the attackers all day, firing from loopholes in the cabin and even keeping a journal of the siege in his pocket notebook. "There are bullets coming like hail," he scribbled. "I am all alone and they intend to kill me if they can." By late afternoon, the gunmen set fire to the cabin to smoke him out. Champion dashed out, gun blazing, and went down in a blaze of bullets, found later with over 2 dozen wounds, and a note pinned to his chest that chillingly read, "Cattle thieves, beware." The invaders had made their grim point, but word of the attack had gotten out. Another settler escaped and raised alarm in the county seat of Buffalo. Soon hundreds of angry citizens, miners, farmers, small ranchers formed a posse and laid siege to the invaders, who holed up at a ranch called the TA. Surrounded and outnumbered, the assassins might have been annihilated, but the cattlemen pulled political strings. The U.S. cavalry from nearby Fort McKinney was dispatched by order of President Benjamin Harrison to rescue the besieged men and prevent further bloodshed. Thus, the Johnson County War ended with an intervention. The would-be vigilantes were saved from frontier justice. Yet justice of another kind proved elusive. Through legal maneuvering, bribery, and influence, none of the captured invaders were ever convicted of the murders. They walked free and even celebrated at the Cheyenne Club with the governor afterwards, toasting their return with champagne and awarding silver commemorative rings to the hired Texas killers. This miscarriage of justice shocked many and tarnished the image of the proud cattle barons. In popular lore, the Johnson County War became a classic tale of David vs. Goliath on the range, small homesteaders standing up to mighty corporate interests. In later films and novels like Shane or Heaven's Gate, echoes of this conflict would resonate as archetypal Western drama. The Johnson County War was perhaps the bloodiest strange war, but it was not the only one. Earlier, in the Lincoln County War of 1878 in New Mexico, factions of ranchers and businessmen, one side notably including the youthful outlaw to be Billy the Kid, fought a vicious feud involving assassinations and standoffs. In Arizona's Pleasant Valley War late 1880s, cattlemen and sheepmen engaged in a notorious feud that nearly wiped out 2 families. Fence-cutting wars occurred in Texas in the 1880s as cowboys, often loyal to open-range ranchers, stealthily cut farmers' barbed wire fences. At least a few deaths resulted before Texas passed laws to curb fence cutting. Even earlier, conflicts with Native American tribes had made the West a contested and violent place for cowboys and settlers alike. Many cowboys of the 1860s and 70s had stories of trading shots with Comanche or Apache war parties, especially when cattle trails crossed Indian lands. Nat Love recalled engaging in fighting Indians on the trail and encountering warriors determined to defend their territory. In reality, by the time large-scale cattle drives began, Most Southern Plains tribes had been forced onto reservations, but occasional raids or conflicts did occur, adding to the atmosphere of danger. Cowboys themselves could also be instigators of trouble. The very term cowboy was used in the Tombstone, Arizona region to describe a loose gang of outlaws, the Clanton and McClory brothers, etc., who smuggled cattle and clashed with lawmen, culminating in the famous gunfight at the Oak Corral in 1881, where lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday shot it out with cowboys. In that instance, cowboy was almost a pejorative, associated with rustling and lawlessness. Meanwhile, in Dodge City or Abilene, drunken trail riders occasionally shot up the town or killed one another in quarrels, prompting mayors to impose weapon bans within city limits, the classic check your guns at the sheriff's office routine for incoming cattle crews. It's telling that many towns had ordinance signs like the one in Dodge, the carrying of firearms strictly prohibited. Such measures were attempts to prevent the volatile mix of youth, liquor, and sidearms from turning deadly. Still, violence flared often enough to keep frontier newspapers busy with reports of shooting scrapes and lynchings. For cowboys working on ranches, conflict more often took the form of protecting herds from rustlers. Cattle theft was an eternal problem. A few stray cows easily disappeared among one's own, and organized rustling rings did operate. Cowboys might volunteer for posses chasing rustlers, or in some cases become rustlers themselves if opportunity knocked and morals were loose. The Code of the West frowned on rustling as the worst of crimes. Stealing a man's horse or cow could be met with a rope and the nearest cottonwood tree. Many a necktie social lynching was carried out on mere suspicion of cattle theft, sometimes without much due process. It was a harsh world, and justice was often extra-legal. Cowboys walked a fine line. They were employees but often sympathized with fellow small ranchers, until loyalty to a paycheck or a patron forced hard choices. Range wars symbolized the end of an era, as open range gave way to fenced pasture, the free-spirited cowboy riding, unfettered across public domain, began to vanish, replaced by more settled ranch hands working on contained spreads. The Johnson County War in particular highlighted that the days of vigilante rule by cattle barons were numbered. Public opinion turned against the big outfits after their murderous actions. The West was getting civilized, for better or worse. By the late 1890s, territories were becoming states, laws more enforced, and the frontier lawlessness taming down. In fact, the last major range war is often cited as the Johnson County conflict, essentially closing the chapter on large-scale open-range violence. For the cowboy, these conflicts were a part of life. He might have carried a Winchester not just for show but because he genuinely might need it in a fight over water rights or to defend the herd from nighttime rustlers. Some cowboys were present at famous battles. For instance, a young cowboy named Claim Agunagull found himself deputized and fighting in the Tonto Basin feud Pleasant Valley War. Others might recount how they rode as shotgun guards with shipments of cattle money to avoid road agents, highway robbers. It was said that a cowboy had to depend on one another. They couldn't stop in a crisis like a stampede or an Indian attack to sort out who's black or who's white. They all had to fight. Adversity bound cowboys together, be it battling nature's fury or human foes. When the gun smoke cleared on the range wars, one thing was certain: the Old West was fading. The larger forces of law, government, and settlement were corralling the anarchic freedom that had allowed such private wars to happen. But in the collective memory, these conflicts left an indelible mark, fueling the notion of the West as a place where justice was sometimes won at the end of a gun barrel, and where cowboys could be viewed as either vigilante enforcers or populist heroes standing against oppression. The reality was complex. Many cowboys were just doing their jobs in these wars, pawns in bigger men's games. Yet stories of battles like Johnson County added another layer to the cowboy's legend, that of the rough frontier warrior, reluctantly drawn into fights in a land with few rules. This layer of violent reality, filtered through time, would later be transformed into the dramatic gunfights and range feuds of Hollywood westerns, a testament to how even the bloodiest chapters of cowboy history became fodder for myth and legend. Riders of many nations, diversity on the range, around the campfires and corrals of the Old West, gathered a remarkably diverse brotherhood of cowboys. Contrary to the Hollywood image of the cowboy as a lone white drifter, the real cattle crews included African Americans, Mexican and Taino vaqueros, Native Americans, and even women. The open range was in many ways an equal opportunity employer, if a tough and low-paying one. All that mattered was whether you could do the work, sit a horse, rope a steer, face danger, and endure hardship. If you proved yourself in those measures, you earned a place in the outfit's respect, regardless of color or background. This social dynamic on the trail was extraordinary for its time, offering a level of camaraderie and equality seldom experienced elsewhere in 19th century America. One often overlooked group is the Black Cowboys. It might surprise many to learn that by some estimates, 1 in 4 cowboys was African American. These were mostly men born into slavery or born just as slavery ended, who found in ranch work one of the few open avenues of employment after the Civil War. Texas, being a former slave state with a booming cattle industry, was a focal point for black cowhands. During the Civil War, ranch owners left to fight, often leaving enslaved workers to tend the herds. Those men became adept at roping, riding, and general cattlecraft. After emancipation in 1865, their skills were in high demand. In fact, as ranching recovered post-war, ranchers were compelled to hire now free, skilled African Americans as paid cowhands to help round up the overgrown wild herds. Men like Daniel Webster A.T. John Wallace, born enslaved in Texas in 1860, went from ranch hand to ranch owner within a few decades, eventually owning a ranch and thousands of cattle by the time of his death in 1939. His story was not unique. On the cattle trails, black cowboys worked, ate, and slept alongside others as equals in labor. They faced discrimination in certain towns. Some hotels and saloons barred them, but within their trail crews they found respect and camaraderie often lacking in society at large. Nat Love, one of the most famous black cowboys, wrote of his frontier friends, "A braver, truer set of men never lived, always ready to share their blanket and their last ration with a fellow cowboy." Love's own life reads like dime novel fiction. Born a slave in Tennessee, he headed west and became a crack shot and expert roper. In Deadwood, South Dakota, he won a roping and shooting contest and earned the nickname Deadwood Dick. Later, using that moniker for his popular autobiography, he drank with Billy the Kid, fought off bandits and native warriors by his account, and survived to tell the tale. When the open range waned, Love eventually became a Pullman Railroad porter. Like many cowboys of all races who had to find new livelihoods. But the legacy of black cowboys endures. Figures like Bo Zickard, who rode with Goodnight and Loving and whose loyalty was immortalized on a grave marker. Goodnight said, "He served with me for years. Never shirked a duty," or Bill Pickett, the black cowboy who became a star of early rodeos by inventing bulldogging steer wrestling. Pickett, born in 1870, grew up after the trail era but learned cowboying on Texas ranches and later wowed crowds by biting a steer's lip and wrestling it down, a technique he learned from observing bulldogs performed in Wild West shows. These men broke barriers, even if their stories were later obscured in popular media until recent historians and museums began spotlighting them. Another pillar of cowboy diversity were the Mexican and Taino cowboys, essentially the direct heirs of the vaquero legacy. Even after Texas was annexed by the U.S., many Tainos Texans of Mexican descent continued working as cowboys on ranches, often on land that had once been their own or their families'. As Anglo ranching spread, Tainos were prized as skilled hands. Along the Rio Grande and South Texas, the majority of cowboys were Hispanic in the post-Civil War era. They brought unique styles, for instance, the flashy charro influence with embroidered jackets and silver spurs persisted in some areas. They also maintained Spanish terms and techniques. It was common to hear Spanish spoken around the chuck wagon or in trail commands in Texas. Notably, vaqueros from south of the border were sometimes recruited up north. Charles Goodnight reportedly employed Mexican wranglers for their superior roping ability. The famous King Ranch in Texas had entire families of Mexican ranch hands, Los Guineos, who helped build that ranch's reputation for excellence. Mexican cowboys also joined trail drives into Kansas and beyond. They might have dressed a little differently, sombreros instead of Stetsons, for example, but when pushing longhorns across Indian territory, they were simply part of the team of hard-working drovers. Unfortunately, like black cowboys, Mexican riders later got short shrift in many history books and films, often relegated to sidekick roles or erased. In truth, they were foundational. The very words rodeo and lariat and chaps are theirs, and their horsemanship was second to none. Native Americans also participated in the cattle frontier, albeit in more limited numbers. Some tribes took up ranching when confined to reservations, for example. the Cherokee Strip Livestock Association involved Cherokee land in present-day Oklahoma being leased for grazing. Native cowboys found work on ranches in the Southwest and West. The Navajo, for instance, became adept ranchers in Arizona after the sheep and cattle were introduced. In the Sid Richardson Museum's account, as cattle trails moved north, Native Americans joined, so the crews were very much mixed on some drives. A notable figure was Boscabo Zickard, already mentioned, who was black, but Goodnight also employed one or two native scouts. Additionally, tribes like the Lakota or Comanche that were subdued in war sometimes had young men who later worked on ranches. For example, some Comanche became ranch laborers in Oklahoma. There's also the phenomenon of the Hawaiian Paniolo, not in the mainland West, but a parallel cowboy culture in Hawaii started when vaqueros were brought there in the 1830s. By late 1800s, some Paniolo competed in rodeos on the mainland. While not numerous in cow camps, native cowboys did exist, and like others, judged by their skill. One legendary character, Jackson Sundown, a Nez Perce cowboy, even won a world rodeo championship in 1916, demonstrating indigenous riders could outperform all comers. 110113111, and then there were women rarely acknowledged, but they were there. The stereotype says cowboying was a man's job, and largely it was, due to the era's norms and the physical dangers, but a few women defied convention. One was Margaret Borland, a rancher who in 1873 became the first woman to lead a cattle drive, driving 2,500 cattle from Texas to Kansas with her 3 young children in tow. She had inherited a ranch and refused to hire a man to do what she could do herself. Another was Lizzie Johnson, known as the Cattle Queen of Texas, who drove her own herds up the trail and made a fortune. Molly Goodnight, wife of Charles Goodnight, ran the domestic side of the Yar Ranch, but also taught cowboys to read and even established a buffalo herd to save the species. There were also anecdotal tales of women disguising as men to work on the range. For example, Charlotte Charlie Parkhurst was actually a stagecoach driver, not a cattle hand, but famously lived as a man for years. One black woman, Johanna July, of black Seminole heritage, managed her family's ranch and was an accomplished vaquera in Texas. Cowgirls in the trail era were few, but by the 1890s women began appearing in Wild West shows and rodeos as skilled riders and ropers. More on that in the next chapter. Within ranch life, wives and daughters frequently helped with roundups, branding, or caring for horses if needed. Julia Blanks, a formerly enslaved woman in Texas, lived on a ranch and recalled how her daughter could take the place of a cowboy and loved to ride, even dressing the part. Such stories remind us that the spirit of the cowboy was not limited by gender, even if social norms kept most women in other roles. 116117112114115 in the microcosm of a trail crew, character often trumped prejudice. A memoir by a white cowboy might note a black cook who was like a father to the younger hands, or a Mexican foreman whose string of curses in Spanish was feared and respected by all. And while broader society in the 1870s, 1,880 seconds was segregated and discriminatory, on the range there was a palpable sense of you do your job, I'll do mine, and we'll get along. Nat Love observed that within a crew, a black cowboy could find a level of equality unknown to other African Americans of the era. That doesn't mean there was no racism. There were certainly racial epithets used casually, and some outfits might refuse to hire men of a certain race, but generally, the economic need for skilled labor overcame many barriers. If you could rope the wildest bronc or find water in a desert, you were valuable, whether you were named Othello or O'Brien or Ortega. Some of the West's legendary figures themselves highlight diversity. Bass Reeves, a black deputy marshal, not a cowboy per se, but operated in the same theater. Isom Dart, an African-American cowboy turned outlaw. Deadwood Dick the Dime novel. Hero was fictional, but Nat Love's nickname blurred into that persona. Chavez Y. Chavez, a Mexican-American in Billy the Kid's gang during the Lincoln County War. Bill Pickett, as mentioned, became a rodeo star. Even the mythic composite cowboy in popular imagination can trace lineage to these real people of color. In recent years, museums and historians have begun to celebrate this tapestry. The black cowboy is now featured in the National Cowboy Museum and African American History Museums. The vaquero has entire exhibits devoted to his legacy. The stories of black women and Mexican women on ranches are gradually coming to light. On the trail, it was not unusual to hear a mix of languages around the camp, English with a southern drawl, Spanish phrases, maybe a smattering of Comanche or a song in Cherokee if a native cowboy was 14 in the group. They traded techniques. Black cowboys learned Spanish roping tricks. White cowboys learned how to survive on the prairie from native scouts. Everyone learned bits of each other's music and folklore. Thus, the cowboy culture itself was a fusion of many cultures. This blend gave the cowboy life a richness that belies the simple stereotype. 118-17119 By the turn of the century, as the frontier closed, some of these diverse cowboys found new arenas. For example, many black and Hispanic cowboys joined the touring Wild West shows or dominated early rodeos. Bill Pickett became world famous, and Mexican trick ropers were always highlights of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The camaraderie forged on the range sometimes carried into these performances, where, behind the scenes, the performers often bunked and ate together without segregation. In summary, the American cowboy was never solely the Anglo-American loner of legend. He was equally likely the son of a former slave, or a Taino whose grandfather herded cattle in Spanish Texas, or a young Cheyenne who had lost the buffalo hunts but gained a job on a ranch. They all rode for the brand. They all swung lariats under the same sun, and when night fell on the prairie, they shared the same coffee and the same songs under the same blanket of stars. In that sense, the cowboy life was a great leveler and inadvertently a quiet canvas of racial progress in an age and place where formal equality was still a distant dream. This diversity enriched the cowboy legacy and helped it endure because it spoke to something universal, the yearning for freedom, adventure, and respect that knows no color. From reality to myth, legendary cowboys and the making of heroic tales, as the cattle trails wound into history and the real cowboys labored in relative obscurity, a new kind of cowboy galloped into the limelight, the cowboy of myth. This cowboy was part truth, part fiction, a larger-than-life character shaped by dime novel writers, newspaper reporters, and the yarns cowboys themselves told around campfires. By the late 19th century, Americans craving tales of frontier adventure turned the working cowboy into a folk hero, blending fact with fantasy. Famous figures, both real and legendary, emerged from this alchemy. Some were actual cowboys whose deeds were exaggerated, others were outright inventions who took on lives of their own. Together, they cemented the image of the Wild West in the popular imagination. One of the earliest to achieve fame in print was Buffalo Bill Cody, not a cowboy drover by trade but a scout, buffalo hunter, and showman who nonetheless became synonymous with the West. In 1869, writer Ned Buntline, pen name of E.Z.C. Judson, published a sensational serialized story, Buffalo Bill, the King of the Bordermen, which wildly dramatized William F. Cody's frontier exploits. It was an instant hit. Buffalo Bill was depicted as a fearless Indian fighter, crack shot, and champion of justice, a template for the cowboy hero, though Cody himself had been an army scout and pony express rider more than a cattleman. Nonetheless, these dime novels conflated all Western roles into a generic prairie hero. Soon, dozens of lurid dime novels, cheap, popular booklets costing 10 cents, featured cowboys and frontiersmen. Titles like Deadwood Dick on Deck, The Prairie Pirate, or Buckskin Jack, The Border Bravo flew off eastern newsstands. One popular series followed Deadwood Dick, a fictional cowboy outlaw loosely inspired by Ned Love's nickname but otherwise imagined by author Edward L. Wheeler. This Deadwood Dick White in the novels, unlike Love, had thrilling escapades, rescuing damsels and outwitting villains. Meanwhile, Wild Bill Hickok, an actual person, got his own dime novel embellishments during his life, painting him as a gunslinging knight of the plains. Perhaps the most important novel in solidifying the cowboy as hero archetype was The Virginian by Owen Wister, published in 1902. Although just after our pre-1900 focus, it distilled the legends swirling 15 around and fixed the image of the strong, silent, honorable cowboy with the famous line, "When you call me that, smile," in response to being called a son of a you-know-what. Wister drew on stories he heard out west, many from real cowboys, and created a quintessential hero in The Virginian. That character's showdowns and romance conveyed a nostalgic longing for the vanishing frontier. The book became a bestseller and influenced every Western novel and film after. But even before Wister, many real cowboys or gunfighters had become legendary in their own time. Billy the Kid, not a cowboy per se, though he did minor cattle herding, was a teenage outlaw whose involvement in the Lincoln County War and subsequent killings made headlines. By the 1880s, he was already a folk figure, and dime novelists fictionalized him as a Robin Hood of the ranges. Jesse James, an ex-Confederate guerrilla turned bank robber, was similarly lionized in popular ballads as a daring rebel again, not a trail cowboy, but often lumped into the Western outlaw mythos that cowboys shared. Then there was Clay Allison, a Texas cowboy and gunman known for volatile temperament, who became the stuff of saloon legend. He reportedly once rode through town dragging a lawyer by a rope, a possibly apocryphal but oft-repeated anecdote. Among actual cattlemen, Charles Goodnight himself became a living legend in Texas. Tales of Goodnight's almost kingly stature on the range and his exploits, like the time he negotiated peace with the Comanche chief Quanah Parker, or his rescue of Loving's body, were told and retold. Goodnight's invention of the chuck wagon, as noted earlier, also secured him a footnote in cowboy lore. Oliver Loving, due to his dramatic end wounded by Indians and dying of gangrene after sending his partner Goodnight ahead, became known as the Lonesome Dove story inspiration. His saga was first told in print in an 1870 seconds magazine and gained mythical tones. John Chisholm, a New Mexico cattle baron, the cattle king of Pecos, who employed many cowboys, became famous for his sprawling herds and was fictionalized in later movies as a central figure in the Lincoln County War. Cowboys also crafted their own legends in the form of tall tales. Around the campfire, one cowboy might boast of a horse so mean it could bite a rattlesnake in two, or joke about the mythical jackalope, a jackrabbit with antelope horns to spook a tenderfoot. The grandest mythical cowboy of all was Pecos Bill, a purely fictional character first popularized in 1910s but likely circulating in oral tradition earlier. Pecos Bill was said to have been raised by coyotes and accomplished outrageous feats, using a rattlesnake as a lasso, riding a cyclone like a bronco, and digging the Rio Grande River. These absurdly exaggerated yarns were the frontier equivalent of Paul Bunyan tales. They painted the cowboy as a superhuman figure dominating the wild landscape. While Pecos Bill came slightly after the 19th century heyday, his tales encapsulated the tall tale tradition that was very much part of cowboy story swapping. Another legendary figure straddling reality and myth was Kit Carson, though primarily a scout and trapper. Earlier, dime novels during the late 1800s often inserted Carson into cowboy-like roles. And of course, we have Wild West show performers like Texas Jacko Mohundro and Buck Taylor, the king of the cowboys, real cowboys who turned performer. Buck Taylor, one of Buffalo Bill's early stars, was advertised as the ideal cowboy and had dime novels written about him too. It's important to note how the myth-making often ignored the diversity we discussed earlier. In popular media of the time, the heroic cowboys were almost always portrayed as white with rare exceptions. Ned Buntline's Buffalo Bill was an Anglo hero saving people from caricatured savages, and Deadwood Dick in novels was white, whereas the real Deadwood Dick Nat Love was black. As the vaquero historian Pablo Rangel observed, once cowboys became fixtures in film early 1900s, the popular perception of cowboys became one of the white single man who was consistently the hero, and the actual Mexican or black cowboys were sidelined or turned into villains. This erasure or vilification happened as myth-making accelerated. While dime novels glorified or villainized individuals, newspapers of the day also contributed. Sensational press coverage of events like the Johnson County War cast the small ranchers as either desperados or victims depending on the paper's sympathies, and the hired guns as either vigilantes or devils. The media fanned the flames of legend by giving nicknames, Billy the Kid, for instance, or calling someone King of the Rustlers, etc. One striking example, after the Johnson County siege, newspapers nationwide covered how the cavalry saved the invaders, adding to the mystique of that event as a grand saga of the West. Real cowboys also enjoyed celebrity in memoirs. Several wrote autobiographies, often with embellishment. Nat Love's 1907 autobiography presents his adventures very colorfully, likely spicing up some incidents to entertain. Teddy Blue Abbott, a Montana cowboy, co-authored We Pointed Them North, giving a frank and humorous account of trail life, which itself helped shape later understanding of cowboys with its memorable lines and anecdotes. These personal narratives, while more accurate than dime novels, nonetheless contributed to the aura because the very act of a cowboy writing a book was exotic to readers back east. By the closing years of the 19th century, the cowboy had transitioned from obscure laborer to national folk hero. In 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner declared the frontier was over, which perhaps intensified the fascination. Americans, sensing the West's wild days were ending, lionized the cowboy as the embodiment of frontier virtues, independence, courage, and ingenuity. Even Eastern magazines started romanticizing them. One Kansas cowtown visitor in the 1870s had described cowboys as very picturesque, if a trifle rough. They have an easy swagger and wear their pistols with an air. This sort of description made the rounds. And in 1885, the New York Times wrote of cowboys in language that mixed awe and alarm, calling them strange riders. With a daredevil gleam in their eye, these threads of legend would later be taken up by Hollywood, but even before the first Western film, the cowboy hero was firmly established in popular culture. He was the Virgilian man of few words and strong morals, or the outlaw with a heart of gold like Deadwood Dick, or the comic supermen like Pecos Bill. Real individuals like Buffalo Bill and Billy the Kid turned into mythic tropes. The showman and the outlaw, and what of the cowboys themselves as they read these yarns? Many could read. Literacy on the range was not uncommon. Molly Goodnight even taught some to read at your ranch. They likely got a kick out of dime novels, even if they laughed at the inaccuracies. Some adapted their own behaviors to fit the legend. For instance, the adoption of flamboyant nicknames Six-Shooter Jim or Powder River Thompson was perhaps influenced by dime novel convention. They were aware, on some level, that they were part of something bigger in the public's mind. Charlie Siringo, a cowboy who became a detective and author, titled his 1885 memoir A Texas Cowboy, or 15 Years on the Hurricane Deck of a Spanish Pony, clearly playing to sensational expectations with that subtitle. In short, by the time the traditional cowboy lifestyle was waning, the legendary cowboy was just hitting his stride. The myth overtook the reality, for better and worse. These legendary tales ensured that even as barbed wire and railroads tamed the West, the cowboy would live on in story and song. People needed heroes, and the cowboy, forged from a mix of actual daring and creative exaggeration, fit the bill splendidly. In the next chapter, we will see how this legend was further amplified and codified by Wild West shows and early rodeos, solidifying the cowboy's place as America's favorite folk hero even as the real cowboys hung up their saddles and faded into history. The Wild West on stage. Buffalo Bill, Wild West shows and rodeos, Wild Dime novels turned cowboys into two-dimensional heroes on paper. It was the Wild West shows that brought the cowboy legend to life before crowds of thousands, and in doing so propelled the mythic image of the cowboy to international fame. Foremost among these spectacles was Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a traveling extravaganza that debuted in 1883 and toured for 3 decades. It wasn't a circus, exactly, nor a theater play, but a new form of entertainment. A historical pageant and rodeo rolled into one. In Buffalo Bill's arena, real cowboys performed roping and riding feats, reenacted dramatic scenes of frontier life, and essentially became actors in a living myth. The show both preserved some authentic skills of the cowboy trade and exaggerated them for dramatic effect, cementing images that still define the cowboy in popular culture. 11. When William Buffalo Bill Cody started his show, he hired genuine cowboys straight off the range. They were men who had ridden on the great trail drives or worked on famous ranches. Cody gave them titles like Cowboy Bend or dubbed certain skilled ones as stars. For example, Buck Taylor was promoted as the king of the cowboys in show posters. Audiences in New York, London, Paris, and beyond were thrilled by the spectacle of lasso tricks, bronco busting, and sharpshooting. In one staple act, a team of cowboys would gallop at full speed, rope swirling and snare galloping horses or running buffalo in mid-stride, demonstrating the vaunted lariat skills inherited from vaqueros. They also performed relay races, staged fox attacks on settler wagons repelled by gallant cowboys and scouts, and engaged in marksmanship contests. Cody, ever the showman, made sure to include lots of gunfire, whooping war cries. He employed Native Americans in the show, too, including famously Chief Sitting Bull for a time in 1885 and heart-pounding chases. In essence, the Wild West show took the elements of cowboy life, horses, cattle, conflict, and camaraderie, and dramatized them into a thrilling narrative of the frontier. One result was that the cowboy's image was sanitized and romanticized. In Cody's arena, the cowboy was always the plucky hero, riding to the rescue or demonstrating honorable sportsmanship. The uglier realities, the drudgery, the ethnic diversity. His shows at first showcased different cultures, but often in stereotyped ways. The violence among cowboys themselves were downplayed or omitted. Mexican vaqueros were actually Part of Buffalo Bill's show, he had a Congress of Rough Riders segment that included Argentine gauchos, Hungarian hussars, and genuine Mexican vaqueros who showed off roping, but they were usually marketed as exotic, while the American cowboy remained the central archetype. An 1893 poster for the show touted a colony of genuine Mexican vaqueros as a highlight, which indicates how Buffalo Bill celebrated vaqueros too, but interestingly, they were presented as a complement to the American cowboys, not the originators. Audiences couldn't get enough. Buffalo Bill's show was such a sensation that by the late 1880s he was arguably the most famous American in the world. One historian wrote, "The life of this hero and showman embodies the desire for history to become myth and myth to become history." Cody was consciously crafting myth, yet he made it feel real. He essentially trained the world to see cowboys as they appeared in his show. The Wild West show also pioneered cowboy competitions. Informal rodeo events within the show like bronc riding and steer wrestling planted seeds for the rodeo sport that took off in the early 1900s. In fact, some of Cody's veteran performers later joined or launched rodeos. Meanwhile, smaller Wild West troops sprang up, copying Buffalo Bill. Notable were Pawnee Bill's show, Ranch Wild West, which emerged in the early 1900s out of Oklahoma's Miller Brothers Ranch, and exhibitions staged at World's Fairs like the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which had a big Wild West component. These shows often employed authentic cowboys down on their luck after open ranges end. For instance, Bill Pickett, the black cowboy mentioned earlier, joined the 101 Ranch show and wowed crowds by single-handedly wrestling steers, introducing a new rodeo event. Bronco John and Coyote Bill and other colorfully named cowboys made careers in performance. Ironically, while the traditional cowboy jobs were dwindling by 1900, a skilled cowhand could still make a living, sometimes a better one, as an entertainer demonstrating those same skills. Wild West shows also spread the cowboy image abroad. European audiences greeted Cody's cowboys with zeal. To them, the cowboy personified American ruggedness. It's said that after one London performance in 1887 for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, the Queen requested a personal meet and greet with the cowboy performers, charmed by their rough manners and superb riding. In Italy, a young man named Benito Mussolini supposedly ran away from home to join Buffalo Bill's show, though briefly, because he was entranced by the cowboy mystique. All over, songs, theater, and later silent films would continue what the Wild West shows started, turning the cowboy into a global icon of freedom. Rodeos, which began as informal ranch contests, evolved into public spectator events by the early 20th century and further entrenched cowboy skills as sport. The first large rodeo meetings, Prescott, Arizona, claims one in 1888. Cheyenne, Wyoming's Frontier Days, launched in 1897, drew former working cowboys to compete in bronc riding, steer roping, and bull riding. Rodeos memorialized the prowess of cowboys in a competitive format and kept alive many techniques of cattle handling long after the daily need for them declined. They also introduced cowgirl competitors, women like Lucille Mulhall and Annie Oakley. Oakley was a sharpshooter in Buffalo Bill's show, not a roper, but similarly part of Western show business. Annie Oakley became a star demonstrating uncanny shooting, further adding to the Wild West legend. Although not a cowboy, her braided hair and Stetson hat in posters associated her with frontier imagery. By 1910, rodeo stars such as Tom Mix, who transitioned to acting in Western films, and Bill Pickett were household names among Western fans. The Wild West shows, while spectacular, were still presented as if they were educational reality. Buffalo Bill often billed his program as showing scenes from frontier life. For example, they reenacted the attack on the Deadwood stagecoach or Custer's last stand. The cowboys in these reenactments thus entered semi-history. Their actions depicted how cowboys and Indians supposedly interacted, which fed the myth of constant conflict in reality. As noted earlier, cowboys seldom fought in set-piece battles against Indians, but the shows made it seem a daily occurrence. The narrative simplified matters. Cowboys equals good, savages equals bad or noble but doomed. Mexican vaqueros, if present, were background color. Black cowboys were rarely individually highlighted, except perhaps as the knowledgeable cook character, or such. Cody did, however, make a point to include real Westerners. He famously had Sitting Bull do a speaking tour, and he once invited legendary lawman Wyatt Earp to participate. Earp declined. He was ironically working as a consultant in early Hollywood westerns by then. Through these shows, the mythic West became a shared cultural memory. even for those who never went west of the Mississippi. A child in Boston or Berlin in 1900 could picture a cowboy vividly: the charging Mustang, the swirling lasso, the shout of yippee-ki-yay, a phrase popularized in Wild West demonstrations, and the image of the rugged hero standing tall. Buffalo Bill's show in particular played on the theme of progress, ending with a tableau of a settler train coming west and being guided by Cody and cowboys, reinforcing the notion that the cowboys were agents of manifest destiny, helping civilization along. The irony was that by showcasing the Wild West, Cody was also announcing its passing. The very popularity of the shows hinged on the idea that this was a last glimpse of a vanishing age. People locked to see real cowboys before they were all gone, and indeed, by the early 20th century, many 19 performers were among the last of their kind in actual experience. As one cowboy performer lamented, "We used to chase real rustlers, now we chase spotlights." But if any regret existed, it was tempered by the pride these cowboys took in their skills and in embodying the legend for new generations. They were, in a sense, curators of cowboy heritage, even as they embellished it. 122 The synergy between myth and reality was captured by commentators of the day. To paraphrase one, the Wild West show has done for the frontier what the epic poets did for ancient wars. It turned contemporary or just recently past events into grand narrative. A historian in our time noted that Cody cultivated and nurtured the Buffalo Bill persona through his show, and popular media combined to exploit myths about Buffalo Bill and his West. Essentially, the West story was consciously mythologized even as it was fresh, and the cowboy was front and center in that myth-making, forever galloping off into the sunset, lasso in hand, victorious over danger. By the 1920s, Wild West shows faded, partly overtaken by film, but rodeos remained, and movies were set to carry the torch of the cowboy myth into a new era. 121 As for the real cowboys who lived to see this all unfold, some embraced it, others were bemused. Nat Love participated briefly in Wild West shows, performing as Deadwood Dick before settling down. One can only imagine him watching a portrayal of Deadwood Dick by some actor, or reading a fanciful story, shaking his head with a wry grin, or imagine a veteran trail boss at a 1910 rodeo, leaning on a fence, critiquing a young bronc rider. "Not bad, son. But you should have seen old Bill back in '78 ride a cyclone and two tornadoes at once." Perhaps they too joined in the gentle bending of truth that is storytelling. In sum, the Wild West shows and the early rodeo circuit froze the cowboy in time as an icon, even as the living conditions that produced him were fading away. They gave people a way to remember or fantasize about the frontier, and they gave many a former cowboy a second act. The world's perception of the cowboy became a carefully staged scene, part history, part showmanship. Yet behind the theatrics, the core appeal endured. The sight of a cowboy on a bucking horse, silhouetted against the sky, hat pulled low, was as stirring on a poster or in an arena as it had been on the open plains. The cowboy had cantered out of reality and squarely into legend, where he would remain for good. The sunset of the cowboy, the end of an era and its legacy. Every golden age must end. And so it was for the era of the open-range cowboy. By the early 20th century, the great cattle drives were largely a thing of the past. The free range was parceled and fenced, and the rough-and-tumble lifestyle of the 1870s cowboy had given way to a more settled ranch routine. The decline of the traditional cowboy lifestyle was not a sudden event, but a steady transformation driven by technological, economic, and social changes. If one listens closely, the closing decades of the 19th century echo with sounds of change: the clatter of railroad wheels, the twist of barbed wire being strung, the scratch of pens signing new land laws, and perhaps the mournful sigh of a harmonica by a campfire as a cowboy contemplates an uncertain future. Several key factors sealed the fate of the open-range cowboy. Foremost was the railroad, where once cattle had to be trailed hundreds of miles to reach a railhead. By the late 1880s and 1892, rail lines penetrated Texas and the West, greatly reducing the need for long drives. When the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Katy Railroad and others built lines into Texas, ranchers could load cattle much closer to home. The long trek to Kansas with its attendant crews was no longer cost-effective. Why pay a dozen cowboys for 3 months when you could pay a few teamsters to drive a short herd to the nearest rail spur in a week? With railroads came refrigerated rail cars and local meat-packing plants. Cattle could be slaughtered nearer their origin and shipped as dressed beef, undermining the old practice of walking cattle to distant markets. As one Smithsonian article succinctly noted, the cattle drives ended by the turn of the century. Railroads became a more prominent mode of transportation in the West. The second, and perhaps most iconic, cause was barbed wire, patented. In 1874, barbed wire quickly became known as the strong fence that tamed the West. Open prairie that had been common grazing land was now sliced into private pastures. By the 1880s, large and small ranchers alike were fencing land to protect water sources and control grazing. This spelled the end of the open range concept. No longer could cattle roam freely over vast distances, and no longer could trail bosses simply cut across whatever land lay in front of them. In many areas, range wars as discussed flared between the fence cutters and the fence builders, but ultimately fences prevailed. Texas and other states passed laws legitimizing fencing and criminalizing fence cutting by the late 1882. By the 1890s, a patchwork of wired properties spread across former open prairies. One cowboy later mused on how barbed wire changed everything. It took the elbow room out of the West. You had to stop and ask whose land you were on. The infinite horizon was now crisscrossed with boundaries. Cowboys found themselves working on ranches that were more stationary, tending cattle within fence sections, mending those very fences, and putting up hay for winter feed, something largely unnecessary when herds could roam to find grass. Another major blow was the aftermath of the overstocking and the great die-up of 1886–87. After that winter, investors pulled out, ranches went bankrupt, and unemployment hit cowboys hard. The big roundups to collect mavericks unbranded cattle became fewer as cattle numbers shrank and ownership was more tightly managed. Many cowboys were simply not needed in the same numbers. Those who stayed in the trade often had to accept lower wages or more settled conditions, for instance, staying on one ranch year-round rather than the transient life of moving from drive to drive. As ranching became more scientific with cross-breeding of cattle for better beef, introduction of feeding regimens, etc., the skills of roaming and trailing were less in demand than skills like fence building, farming to grow winter feed, or managing breeding stock. Some cowboys adapted and became what one might call ranch hands or farm-ranch hybrids. Others decided that life was too dull and drifted to other work or locations. Government policy also played a role. The Homestead Act encouraged farmers, and subsequent acts allowed ranchers to homestead small plots, which they sometimes did to block others' access. By 1890, the U.S. Census famously declared the frontier closed, meaning there was no longer a clear line of unsettled territory. Settlement was everywhere. The era of free public domain land for the taking was over, or nearly so. Additionally, the removal of Native American tribes to reservations was essentially complete by the late 1880s. This ironically made ranching safer, but also signaled the finality of one epoch. A line in the Smithsonian piece on Black Cowboys encapsulates it. Railroads were invented, and Native Americans were relegated to reservations, all of which decreased the need for cowboys on ranches. The cowboy's initial job to utilize the open range vanished when the open range itself vanished under the forces of civilization and capital. 135136 for the cowboys themselves. The decline came with personal reckonings. Many, like Nat Love, decided to move on. Love famously wrote that to the wild cowboys used to the unrestricted life of the boundless plains, the new order of things did not appeal. Many of us became disgusted and quit the wild life for pursuits of our more civilized brother. He went on to become a Pullman porter on a railroad, a steady, respectable job for a black man in that era, but worlds away from roping Mustangs. Other cowboys turned to different kinds of work: mining, law enforcement, farming, or business. A significant number joined Wild West shows and rodeos as noted, effectively making a living off their past by reenacting it. Some, it must be said, couldn't adjust. A few continued a nomadic life as drifters or range loafers, picking up odd jobs at roundups or breaking horses here and there. The image of the old cowboy reminiscing about the glory days became a trope in itself, the veteran trail boss sitting outside a saloon, lamenting, "These young fellows will never know how it was." Similar to how aging soldiers talk of old wars, ranching itself certainly didn't disappear. If anything, it industrialized. Huge corporate ranches with Chicago or foreign investors gave way or reorganized into more modest operations with tighter margins. Stockmen's associations merged and lobbied for reforms. Notably, the Packers and Stockyards Act of 1921 was passed to protect ranchers from monopoly meat packers, following years of efforts by people like Murdo Mackenzie and others to stabilize the industry. But by that time, the classic era was long gone. Ranches had telephones, automobiles might be coming in, and the cowboy on horseback was no longer the sole custodian of the herds. Eventually, trucks and trailers would start moving cattle, but that's beyond our timeline in the immediate sense. By about 1900 to 1910, the transformation was such that one Texas rancher quipped, "We're all farmers with a herd attached." Now, highlighting that running a ranch now involved crop cultivation for feed and living with neighbors rather than ranging free. Technology crept in, the windmill allowed pumping water in places without streams, reducing the need to move cattle for water. Vaccines and veterinary science slowly improved to control Texas fever and other diseases. Texas fever's solution, partly, was to crossbreed the immune longhorns with fatter breeds like the Santa Gertrudis breed developed on King Ranch. By 1920 seconds, eliminating the longhorn's necessity. With such changes, the rough work became somewhat less rough and more routinized. Symbolically, events like the closing of the Zit Ranch in 1912, the last cattle sold off, marked the end of the open-range giants. The Zit had been one of the grandest experiments, millions of acres fenced in the Texas Panhandle. Its failure and breakup into farms and smaller ranches was like the falling of an empire. Similarly, Montana's open range came to a close by the 1890s after harsh winters, and an influx of sheep. Cattle vs. sheep conflicts were also part of range wars. Sheep often won by simply being more numerous and hardy, and many cattle ranges were converted to sheep ranches, altering the cowboy dynamic. By 1910, the figure of a sheepherder with a pack of dogs was more common in some areas than a lone cowboy trailing 1,000 longhorns. Yet, interestingly, while the traditional role declined, the cultural ascendancy of the cowboy rose. It was as though the cowboy had to fade from reality to fully rise as myth. People began to preserve the memory. Museums like the National Cowboy Museum, eventually founded in mid-20th century, and Western lore societies started later, but even in the 1920s, books and articles fondly recalled the cowboy days. Former cowboys wrote down their memoirs, like Andy Adams' Log of a Cowboy in 1903, which was a fiction but based on real experience, reading almost like a diary of a cattle drive. These accounts served as last testaments of an age. For the places that once thrived on cowboy business, change was evident. Cowtowns like Dodge City saw their wild days end by mid-1880s, and they settled into quiet respectability. Some, like Abilene, went back to being farming communities. Fortunes shifted. Some ex-cowboys became ranch owners themselves, like Daniel W. Wallace, the black cowboy who owned multiple ranches by later life. Others, less fortunate, ended up as penniless old-timers reliant on the charity of the new townsfolk. In some western towns today, one can find graves of old cowboys who died in the 1910s 30s, with epitaphs like "He rode for the XL Ranch, faithful to the end." In an economic sense, the era ended with a whimper, not a bang. There was no specific date where one could say no more cowboys, but by about 1915, if you saw a group of men on horseback driving 22 cattle down a main street, it was likely a special event, not a routine occurrence. The last big trail drive of any note from Texas to Montana occurred in 1897. After that, drives were local or two railheads short distances. One by one, the old trails grew quiet. The Chisholm Trail, once scarred with hoofprints, was intersected by farms and towns. The trail itself faded into plowed fields and memory. An Oklahoma newspaper in 1930 ran a nostalgic piece titled "Last of the Chisholm Trail Riders is Gone," noting the passing of an old cowboy who'd made that trek in youth. Thus, the sunset of the cowboy era came gradually, bathed in the golden glow of nostalgia even as it happened. Cowboys themselves were often the first nostalgists. "It's touching that even as Nat Love took tickets on a train, he wrote wistfully of the old days." Or that Bo Zickard's tombstone, paid for by Goodnight, so lovingly commemorated his cowboy virtues. They knew they had been part of something unrepeatable. If one imagines a final scene, perhaps a cowboy stands at a rail depot, holding his saddle, waiting for a train to take him to some new job in town. He hears the distant low of cattle and remembers being young and at the head of a wild herd. He tips his hat to that memory and boards the train. It's not the heroic shootout of movies. It's more subtle, a way of life, just quietly riding into the sunset. And yet the cowboy never truly rode away. In myth and memory, he is immortal. The mythic cowboy continues to ride across movie screens, book pages, and the imagination of each new generation who yearns for freedom and adventure. The actual old cowboys may have hung up their spurs, but their legacy transformed into a foundational American story. In that sense, the end of the historical era was the beginning of the legend that will never die, as long as people speak of. Courage, self-reliance, and the open road, the cowboy will be there part fact, part fiction, trotting forever across the fading but never forgotten American frontier.